Okay, everyone, I think we're going to get started. I want to welcome everyone to our Thursday lunchtime lecture in recognition of National Public Health Week. Today we have with us Deli, who is our UC Presidential Chair, as well as a Professor of Population Health and Disease Prevention. And just for purposes of time, I'm just going to kick it to him. As you see, we are recording this, so it will be available later on for you to review. And we also ask that you use any of the Q&A function towards the end, that Q&A feature down there for question and answer. So with that, Deli, I'm going to let you take it away.
Thank you very much, Brianna. It's a great honor for me to be part of this National Public Health Week celebration at UC Irvine. And I look forward to sharing some of my work and the work of my colleagues with you all. I'm delighted that this is being recorded, so those who are not able to join today can review and follow up as needed. I think it's a very busy week, and I appreciate your time. We have about 45 to 50 minutes. I hope to get through discussion, but I'm available to follow up if anybody wants to talk more about this topic. So if you around in the 60s, there was a book by William S. Burroughs called The Electronic Revolution. It was in plural, and it was a very different topic. I didn't read that book when I wrote an article with my colleagues published in Science, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this presentation, called The Electronics Revolution, from E-wonderland to E-wasteland. And today's topic is looking at the reverse of that trajectory based on what has happened over the last 20 to 30 years as we've all become addicted to our mobile phones and computer lifestyles, using Zoom for everything. It's really an explosion. So I hope today to really touch on a few key points. You might even consider this slide a conclusion, so that the take-home messages are not lost in the discussion. So first, there are too many children, women, and underemployed men risking their lives and their health in artisanal mining of hazardous electronic waste. And I hope I will convince you that it is indeed hazardous, and there are reasons why people all over the world risk their health and the health of the planet to get small amounts of precious resources that from the waste that we all generate. The technical solutions that have been proposed over the last 10, 20 years have really not kept up with the scale of the problem. The profits are rolling in for large corporations. If you think about it, those who manufacture and sell electronic products are now among the richest companies on the planet. And then we try to do top-down solutions in terms of policy, but those are not well integrated to balance the needs for labor and safety. And we'll talk about those as well. There are a number of grassroots community-level advocacy programs that really have a hard time communicating the uncertainty in the risks and the benefits of the electronics revolution. And in fact, it's become a bring your own expert situation where you can find an expert to talk about the risks outweighing the benefits, and those who think the benefits outweigh the risks. So there's a need to really talk about the uncertainty and why we need to take action despite those uncertainties. And then increasingly, there's a lot of interest in the legal framework around electronic waste and artisanal mining. and it's codified in the environmental justice movement, but we don't quite yet have an agenda for what the environmental justice considerations should be. So we'll talk a little bit about that now, follow up with a concluding set of statements and recommendations. At any time during this talk, please feel free to post questions in the Q&A or the chat. I won't be monitoring those, but it will make our time at the end a little bit more straightforward. So let's begin with the first chapter of this presentation and the conclusion that too many children, women, underemployed men risk their health in artisanal mining of hazardous electronic waste. If you consider the first step in what we call the life cycle of electronic products, it's become extremely hot and controversial. Every battery, phone, computer that we are all in possession of uses cobalt. And cobalt is mined in very few places on Earth. About 50% of the supply of cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And in 2019, a lawsuit was brought forward by the international rights advocates on behalf of 14 families and injured children for damages based on forced labor, unjust enrichment, negligent supervision, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. It is the legal lingo. Of course, the livelihood of children and families who work in these mines, they think they're providing for their own livelihood, but it's a situation where the conditions under which they labor, reaping profit, right, for the large corporations, but their livelihood never actually gets better. In fact, with the pollution and the physical stresses and the emotional stresses, it may even get worse. This lawsuit is still making its way through the courts, but the work that supported the lawsuit was actually done by, in large part, by Siddhartha Kara, who was a guest at UCI. Also in that year, the work was funded by the British Academy, and he came to talk in our community resilience initiative. So UCI has been connected to this, but more recently, regarding cobalt and all the metals that we depend on, just a couple of weeks ago, March 31st of this year, President Biden issued an executive order under the Defense Production Act. A lot of people may not have paid attention to this because we have the war in Russia and Ukraine going on, and a lot of sanctions have to do with not getting resources from Russia, natural resources, petroleum, coal, but also some critical metals. And I think the executive order, if you look at the text, talks about lithium, nickel, cobalt. These are essential metals for all electronic gadgets. And if you drive an electric car that depends on a lithium battery, you're buying cobalt and lithium from these sources that are very questionable, potentially illegal treatment of workers. The other aspect of President Biden's executive order is to now focus US's resources and energy and technological prowess into environmentally responsible domestic mining and processing, recycling and reuse, and recovery from unconventional and secondary sources, such as mine waste. He didn't explicitly say electronic waste, but that is probably one of the largest sources of these metals that we have in the United States, that we don't have to go outside the US to get, and that if we have a good process for recycling and reuse, we could limit our vulnerability to foreign sources while also protecting child labor from abuse and have those kids in school. What is the evidence that we have these mineable resources in the US? Not only do we have, US is probably still the largest producer of electronic waste. China is fast catching up. Europe also has a lot, but we don't treat them properly. This was also just a few months ago. Walmart was sued by the state of California and 12 other states over alleged improper disposal of electronic and hazardous waste, compromising local landfills. These are toxic components, and it's a waste. According to Biden's executive order, these are the resources that we could be mining for lithium, for cobalt, nickel, and other critical elements that would really put a dent in solving the problem. And so we fight a lot of wars in the legal system, when in fact the solutions will be a lot more cost effective. It's not just Walmart. This is me and my postdoc researcher, Dr. Megan Chen, and a worker at Goodwill. Goodwill Orange County does take electronic waste for recycling. They employ a lot of people, including people with developmental disabilities. The day that I visited, I interviewed some of the workers and talked to the staff. But you will see on the far right of this chart that some Goodwill no longer accept e-waste. It's just we don't have the infrastructure for proper collection and recycling. And even the Goodwill Orange County that advertises that they take e-waste, if you look at the list of things that they say they do not accept, batteries of any size, and that's precisely where the cobalt is. Whiteboards, what they call hazardous materials, and I'll show you that all e-waste is in fact hazardous materials. They do give those who work at the Goodwill some personal protective equipment, but I think where the ultimate waste ends up after they've disassembled is still questionable. They also don't take light bulbs. LEDs are essentially electronic waste. And so there's a big swath of things that consumers don't have a way to dispose of properly. And we end up putting hazardous materials into landfills when we finally decide that we need to clear out that old desk or drawer, and we put things in either the recycling bin or the domestic waste bin in our homes. This has become such a big problem that the International Labour Office of the United Nations published, the distribution of electronic waste shipped illegally and the places where they go all over the world for hazardous labor. People receive the United States electronic waste in South America, in Africa, in Asia, and of course also Europe and Australia were shipping waste to Asia. China recently passed laws to ban importation of electronic waste, but there are so many loopholes in terms of refurbished equipment, second-hand uses that ultimately end up being disposed into the environment. So according to the ILO, about 80% of the waste that we generate ultimately make it into international level. So where are these people in the world who receive and process this? There are too many of them laboring under really dangerous situations. Last year, in June 2021, the World Health Organization released a landmark report that children working in these digital dump sites are exposed to really toxic materials. According to the WHO, we have even less proportion, 17.4% of e-waste is collected and appropriately recycled. And we have 12.9 million women working in this sector, 18 million youngsters who should be in school working to take apart the phone, the battery, the screen, in that process, being exposed to things that could impact their health throughout their lives. I mean, lead, for example, is one of those. In the preface to that report, WHO Director Tedros warned that this is a tsunami of e-waste, comparing it to microplastic pollution and even climate change, in warranting international cooperation and collaboration to really make a dent in these digital dump sites. But it's not just going to be policy top-down from WHO. It's going to be a need to engage manufacturers and the public in really crafting sustainable solutions. When that report was released by WHO, I was immediately called for an interview by a representative of the Lancet, which is a major journal in health. And they asked me questions about my thoughts on that report. And this is exactly what I said, that first of all, there has to be solutions to keep children from these digital dump sites. Children need to be in school, not be working in a very hazardous labor market, using their hands to disentangle and disassemble electronic gadgets, burning plastics, and exposing the whole environment to dangerous metals. And so we need an educational reform. UNESCO needs to be engaged, ILO needs to be engaged, and more importantly, all of the companies that benefit from this process needs to be brought to account. And I named Apple, Microsoft, Samsung, Dell. There's a lot of them that have the resources to make sure that this no longer endangers the large number of women and children. In my own work, in my lab, we have done quite a lot of research thinking about what is the likelihood of exposures to these materials, simulating the processes that are used, for example, burning the plastics to release the copper. This work was done for her PhD by Kathleen, we call her Charlie Hibbert. She now works for the EPA. And we bought a shredder, we bought an oven for the lab to really go through that process, and then use models to assess the chemicals released and leached, and what cases of cancer, non-cancer diseases we could expect from the population of artisanal miners, particularly children and the women working in those in the processes. And then with another postdoc, Narendra and I, and Yuan, we worked to look at the literature on the pregnancy and neonatal health outcomes associated with exposure to e-waste disposal. And you might recognize a lot of the chemicals on this chart: polyaromatic hydrocarbon compounds, lead, cadmium, chromium, nickel, and of course, brominated flame retardants. These are well-known toxicants that affect the fetus and also development once a child is born. And so we have evidence that, in fact, this is not labor that has no consequences. The amount of money that these laborers get out of e-waste processing probably will not support the healthcare needs that they have. So in many ways, it is a lost labor that is actually detrimental. So what have been the technical solutions that have been proposed, and why have they not been scalable? This is a picture on the left panel of Daisy the robot. In a way, you might think of it as the ultimate technical solution developed by Apple. Each of these robots cost more than $1 million. I think Apple only has 2 or 3 that they've made. And it can take apart your phone in less than 5 minutes to disassemble the parts, recover the battery, and have plastic separated and the metals on one hand so that you can reuse these products in new phones. But you know, it's a far cry from the places I visited in Ghana, in panels B and C, where people are, you know, using their hands to do essentially the same things. It takes a longer time, but the exposure is palpable. You can look at the soil, the burnt materials. In Ghana, there's this market with the river flowing through it, and see the color of the river. Ash and all kinds of toxic materials have been deposited in the water. And researchers have looked at the blood level of workers. They've determined that there are many toxic materials that are in their systems that will take a lot of clinical care to intervene and get them healthy. In China, I visited in Beijing. There's a huge stockpile. You can find relatively clean facilities for disassembling electronic products, but the capacity is just not there. So if we could scale down this kind of robots to work in places like this, I think we might be able to put a dent on the volume of e-waste as we all go from iPhone 5 or 6 or 7 to iPhone 12 and changing our laptops regularly to reduce the volume, but also to make the ones that we cannot do without not pose problems for the environment. So in my lab, we have a public advocacy campaign. I have videos on YouTube, thanks to the work of the UCI communications team, lots of magazine articles, and this picture on the top right used to be on the side of a bus that circulated in the UCI community, where I was called the Toxicity Avenger. All of that helps the public communication aspect of the work. This video is still available on YouTube to help people see how we come up with the conclusion that e-waste is toxic and that we need to do our part in keeping them out of the domestic waste bin and landfills and international shipment. But the work that we do has led also to policy changes. So this work in 2007 was led by former PhD student Johnny Lincoln, who's now CEO of his own company, Axiom Materials. And it's very interdisciplinary. And Lincoln has now endowed our World Institute for Sustainable Development of Materials wisdom, because he's been very successful in his business. But I do the health, Andrew Shapiro working at NASA and electric engineering, and John Daniel Saforis working in economics and civil and environmental engineering, really produced the first set of studies using a wide range of methods to simulate worst case scenarios when you put your cell phone or laptop into the domestic bin. These methods are different. If you look at the second column here, the TCLP, or total toxicity characteristic leaching procedure, is the EPA criterion, and they use a mild pH, 4.9, similar to what you might expect with acid rain, and small particle size dilution factor. And we have to extract for 18 hours and then test what chemicals leach out. But if you look at the California TTLC, we're much more stringent. We use pH less than 1, particle size less than 2. And so California, using some of the results that we generated, was among the 4 states to really categorize electronic waste as hazardous, which makes it fall under different categories of waste collection and treatment and disposal. And in those tests, we identified a wide range of potentially toxic chemicals. Lead was significantly higher than the federal or state level of acceptability. And that, as we know today, there is no safe level of exposure to lead, particularly for children, because their developmental stages can be impacted very, very strongly. And so we focused on lead, and there's been a lot of work and campaign to get electronic products to be free from lead. Lead is used particularly in the soldering materials. If you've ever opened any electronic product and you see the green printed wiring board and all of the components essentially glued to the baseboard, they used to use lead, tin lead solder, and that was the source of the lead. But from the beginning of making electronics to the disposal, lead is just very dangerous for the environment. And for the Minerals, Metals, and Materials Society, we produced a webinar on this life cycle approach to lead in electronics, and also the public health and environmental benefits of adopting safer alternatives. With former student, Jamie Allgood, who actually is the first to earn a dual degree JD PhD at UC Irvine, worked with me to show that manufacturers need to not worry only about the end of life disposal of e-waste, but some of the toxic chemicals that are used, particularly halogenated flame retardants, are actually shed into our homes, our offices, our labs while we are using these products. And so she vacuumed a lot of spaces at UCI and analyzed for these flame retardants and zoned in on the category of flame retardants that are associated with electronic products. So we are all kind of exposed even during use. And so it's a stronger incentive for the manufacturers to not only think they're doing work that benefits people in Asia and Africa and South America receiving e-waste, that changing the manufacturing practices now actually also benefits Americans and Europeans. We've done this work with other components of electronic waste, the rechargeable batteries in particular. For a long time, I think even now, if your rechargeable battery on your mobile phone or your computer breaks, you have to get rid of the entire equipment, because at least for Apple, it's not easy to take the battery out and just replace the battery. So this makes the life span of electronic products shorter. There are always components that you can replace and not have to dispose of everything. But we show that even the rechargeable lithium-ion batteries have a very strong impact. And as I mentioned, cobalt was one of the easiest to leach out of this waste. And if we can figure out a way to collect this cobalt so that we don't have to go to the Democratic Republic of Congo to rely on children mining cobalt, that's a big win globally. And that article was important enough for Science to cover it in the editor's choice. Similarly, as I mentioned, Goodwill does not take light bulbs. And so we compared light emitting diodes, which are really electronic products. They have the same basic structure as the printed wiring board. And we showed that there are also metals that leach out of that in comparison to compact fluorescent light bulbs that contain mercury and incandescent bulbs that don't have these kinds of toxic metals, although they can have lead in the contacts. And so the move to go from incandescent bulbs because of climate change considerations and energy savings might actually be giving us things that are potentially more dangerous because typically in the old days, if your incandescent bulb burns out, you just put it in the trash. We can't do that with LEDs or CFLs. And so we need to educate the public about what to do with these electronic components. So technical solutions have not really been successful, in part because I think we see manufacturers really picking and choosing how they become engaged. And so I was honored and happy to be invited to join Apple's Green Chemistry Advisory Board. I'm currently the co-chair of the board. And one of our goals is to help Apple really look to the entire life cycle of their products so that they can install safer alternatives. I was invited by Art Fong, who's right next to Lisa Jackson, who's their environmental director. Lisa Jackson used to work as the EPA administrator, and so she went to Apple after leaving the Obama administration. And Art Fong is actually a UCI PhD alumni, getting his PhD in environmental toxicology. And the board consists of people, acclaimed internationally here in China and in Europe. And we hope this is a template for engaging the technology sector so they can scale down things like the Daisy robot, but also scale up their work in eliminating these dangerous chemicals from their products. The work of the Apple Green Chemistry Advisory Board, this is a thank you note that we received, excuse me, last year from Art Fong, after Apple won the 2021 Safer Choice Partners Year Award. And the profile really specifically pointed to Apple's work in eliminating some of the toxic chemicals from their supply chain. So the work does have impact, but it can take a while. So let's turn a little bit now to top-down policy solutions that are not very well integrated. And it doesn't mean we give up on them. It just means we will continue to work harder. So I mentioned the title of this presentation as a revision to this article that we published in the Policy Forum of Science in 2009. At the time, we were concerned about the international movement of electronic products, what we call E-wonderland. California is an electronic wonderland, so E-wasteland. But the limitations on things like cobalt is having us rethink and revise how can we move e-waste back to the wonder of electric cars and cell phones, and because the policies on recycling are not well integrated with the need for labor among those who process e-waste. And we are short-sighted in having policies focus on only one aspect of the life cycle of these products. And in the WHO report, you would see that the countries in red have no e-waste legislation policy. They don't restrict the movement of e-waste internationally or domestically. The ones in green have it, but in many cases not actually quite enforced. And so one of the recommendations of the WHO report is to establish global policies and national regulations to phase out the use of the most hazardous components in electronics and electrical equipment, and to promote reduced risk alternatives, taking into account the life cycle of substances and products. And if you look at where there are gaps, right? So in the top line here, top row is 2015, 2019 in the bottom row. And the columns, Canada, United States, France, and England. And this data come from self-reports from the Global E-Waste Monitoring Statistics Partnership. And the numbers in the circles are about how much e-waste we recycle. Obviously, there's something wrong in North America. Canada and the US are both under 20%. Although Canada retains 14% between 2015 and 2019, the US has actually gone down 19% in 2015 to 15% in 2019, maybe even further down as a result of the pandemic. Whereas in Europe, both France and England, 48% and now 56%, England 45%, now 57%. So somehow their policies and community and individual engagement is working in a way that's not working in the US. In the US, we also have differences across states. And this is a failure, in my view, of the EPA in getting us all on the same page. Some states, 25 states, have passed legislation mandating statewide e-waste recycling, which is about 65% of the US population. But as we know, that's not enough. And the legislation in each state is actually quite different. And so there is a lack of coordination that allows loopholes into the policies. In California, one of the most stringent, every time you buy a video display, anything with a video display, you're actually paying $6 to $10 to the state for recycling purposes. That's part of the Electronic Waste Recycling Act. But we've argued that this is not enough incentive. We've done studies showing that people are willing to pay a premium of 1%. So if you buy a $1,000 computer, that's about $100 that people are willing to pay. Of course, ultimately, we want manufacturers to take responsibility. So we have something we call extended producer responsibility, that money shouldn't have to come from individual pockets, consumers' pocket, because in a way that could create another problem in access and equity to these very useful products if people are not willing to pay or absorb that cost. But at least it shows that we can form policy based on surveys like this. This was a survey of California households. We've done surveys of US households published in 2009 to begin. All states were included. People typically have about 4 of these gadgets, and they will pay or travel about 4 miles to put them in places. So we've argued also that policy and regulatory innovations need to go hand in hand with the technical innovations for them to be very effective. I'm gonna shift to the last part of this. I know we're running out of time. One of the big challenges in the policy is also that the right to repair products was fought by manufacturers for a long time until this Supreme Court case in 2017, where they said in the case of impression products and Lexmark, which makes printers and printer ink, and the majority opinion was that manufacturers and consumers both have the right to repair, which will reduce the volume of e-waste generated. Justice Neil Gorsuch recused, probably because he has a conflict of interest, but Justice Ginsburg was arguing for the case, but had concerns about the international interpretation of the ruling, and so you can refer to her argument in thinking how best to make this a global policy change that might actually have impact. We have done some work to address some of the manufacturers' concerns that they'll lose money if they allow third party to repair their products, and using blockchain to track used electronics might be one way to go. And then finally, in terms of community level advocacy, as I mentioned, the translation of scientific uncertainty is a major thing. The US is not a signatory to the United Nations Basel Convention. And so we have all kinds of loopholes about, well, there's not enough epidemiological evidence, but we need to be able to get people protected under the precautionary principle, even without the evidence. And I've interviewed colleagues in anthropology who are thinking a lot about the environmental justice considerations. Grace Akese and Peter Little have really visited the same place in Ghana that I've also visited, really thinking about how to protect the jobs and also protect the health of the artisanal miners, and their work has been very influential. So in conclusion, revising the electronic revolution really means going from the e-wasteland back to products and to companies, and minimizing our reliance on child labor, women labor, and planetary health issues that are really damaging the environment and people's health. If we can do this, we would have an electronic revolution that actually works well for everybody. So we need to integrate justice into the circular economy framework to protect planetary health. And we've published some of these ideas in Nature Electronics in 2019, promoting justice that includes industries and the entire product life cycle, making artisanal mining safer by eliminating chemicals that are dangerous, investing in product recovery infrastructure for the US, and putting consumers' education first in that infrastructure, working with manufacturers and the principles of green chemistry, and then enforcing those policies that prevent us from shipping hazardous waste across boundaries. Thank you very much. I went a little bit over, but I'm willing to stay longer to answer questions if there are any, but people can also reach me by email after this presentation. Thank you. I see some of our audience remained, so if you're willing to raise your hand or put stuff in the chat, I think Rosanna, please, yeah.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate listening to all the good work that you and your groups have done over the years. I remember the 1960s and the commercial that they had at that time with a Native American standing by a river full of pollution. So this has been something that has been on my mind since I was quite young. I even wrote the President Johnson in regards to the pollution. Do you feel that there has always been sort of this common theme when it comes to pollution, in the sense that it has a tendency to hit lower income people and especially people of color, and how do we, as part of that education and social justice, start to shift the thinking on that? I love the work that you're doing with Apple. I'm glad they're doing it. I expect that they would do it, but I'm interested to see if, you know, maybe there's more work that all of us could do.
Thank you very much, Rosanna. That's an extremely important question. I'll begin with Apple. When I joined the Green Chemistry Advisory Board for Apple, they actually also had a committee on community engagement, but that did not survive. I think companies are always fearful of lawsuits when they start talking to communities. And I think one of the areas of research that really needs to be pursued urgently is how can you create space for these technological solutions coming from manufacturers and the activism of community engagement to be together without the companies fearing that anything they say will be used against them in a court of law, and the community members trusting that this is a space where they can really share what is hurting them, that they need jobs, what they need them to be safe jobs and not have their environments polluted. So that's an area that we're working on, and it's a lot of, so that's why I began to work with the anthropologist, Peter Little in particular. So I think that that's a very, very important point. The 60s, remember that was also when the Silent Spring was published, and you know, we owe some of the policies that came out. In fact, the creation of the National Environmental Policy Act that led to the establishment of the EPA in 1970 was in part because of all of the atrocities that we all see with, you know, silent rivers and birds dying from DDT, and I think we tend to have solutions and then we create new problems. Nobody thought we would be using lead in electronics after all that we've seen, the damage of lead from petroleum, but we did. And so vigilance and education is critical. And I, you know, it's the progress, I have to admit, is incremental, because we've always, especially in the US, shied away from what the Europeans call the precautionary principle. If there's even a hint that something will be dangerous, we should not allow it to go forward. Another committee that I worked with, the California Green Ribbon Science Panel, which was Governor Schwarzenegger's initiative, actually, it's called the Safer Consumer Products Law now, tries to do that, to say you cannot sell something in California known to be potentially hazardous at any time in its life cycle. But we have involved students, our students, in this project as well. Thousands of papers and letters from industries fighting this law, because it would mean, you know, California is a big market, and so anything they can't sell in California is a big loss. We even included automobile lead acid batteries. If you know the case of Exide factory in Los Angeles, and as you said, it's always the poor communities that have these kinds of factories in the middle of their neighborhoods. And Exide polluted the Vernon district of Los Angeles with so much lead that it will take years and years and millions of dollars to clean it up. And now they have gone bankrupt and the state is left holding the bag. So we need to make companies responsible while they're still profiting, not after they're done and neighborhoods are polluted. And that's a long answer to your question, but it's very, very important for research and activism.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Shipra, has a question about where can we responsibly recycle used electronics. So now in California, you can actually still take to Goodwill, but as I showed, there are things that they will not accept. If you are buying, you can walk in, when Sears was still in business, you could actually take, they had these boxes in the stores where you can drop your old phone. So there are fewer and fewer places. The Orange County has a hazardous waste disposal facility. Most counties do, but for many people, it's still out of reach. It's too far. There's only one, and they're not well advertised. So I would always ask, if you want to buy from Apple, for example, they ask you, they have a third party who can ship a box to you. You can put your old electronic product into that box and ship it away. But it's, again, it's a 2, 3, maybe 4-week process, and people tend to want to move on. So we need to make it easy for people to dispose or to return their products. There are companies that take products that are still functional but maybe old, and they can used to donate them to veterans or people serving in the military or humanitarian work overseas. But I would research those places very carefully to make sure that they don't just take the best and then throw away the others. I think that's part of what Walmart was guilty of, that they collected these items but never really processed them. So I think it's our responsibility as consumers to do a little bit of homework on Google, or a couple of phone calls to know that when you return your used electronics, that the company that takes them actually are well-meaning and they're not just looking for cheap profit. I'm on the Irvine City Green Environmental Committee, and I think this issue comes up regularly. How can we make it easy? Maybe a fourth bin, regular recycling, green waste, kitchen waste, and then hazardous waste that they come and collect maybe once a month, so that people are not storing things and then just throwing them out when they move. But there are some options, but my best answer is to research them carefully before you pick one. It's a little bit of time, but it's worth it when you think about the magnitude of the problem. Thank you. Are there any other questions? We're 3 minutes before the top of the hour, but about 14 minutes past when we said we will stop this. Okay, well, if there are no more questions, this will be available for review. I want to thank Nina, Brianna, Rosanna, my department, Population Health and Disease Prevention, really very supportive in this kind of interdisciplinary research and education. Many students have been trained. I mentioned Jamie Allgood, JD, PhD, lots of MPH students who follow this line of work, and I'd be happy to continue that work. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Should acknowledge that Rajiv Ramdeo, illustrious MPH alumni of our program, was in the audience. He may have left, I don't know, but really happy to see students coming back to celebrate with us. Thank you, Rosanna. Thank you.
Thank you so much.